I recently found myself trapped in a special kind of modern-day labyrinth. The problem was simple, a small issue with a company, but the solution was designed to feel impossible. First, there was the website, a maze of menus that led only to more menus, no phone number, of course, just a help button that funneled me into a series of multiple-choice questions, a pre-selected list of miseries where none quite matched my own. After picking the least wrong option, a chat window popped up. "Hello," it chirped, with a cheerful little avatar. "I'm your AI helper." I explained my problem carefully and clearly. It responded instantly by sending me a link to the exact same help page I had started on. I was in a loop, an endless automated circle designed not to help, but to manage, contain, and ultimately to prevent me from ever reaching an actual human. And in that moment of pure algorithmic frustration, it struck me. This isn't just about bad customer service. This is the new fabric of our society. We now have to make an appointment to speak to a person at a bank. We get diagnosed by web forms before seeing a doctor. We're subtly being trained to interact with systems instead of people. We're becoming isolated aliens in a world of our own making, and it makes you wonder, in a reality, this automated and artificial, what does a word like free even mean anymore? Today, we're taking a deep dive into that very question. We're exploring the intricate and, often contradictory meanings of freedom in a rapidly changing world. We'll be looking at the historical and cultural threads that define this really powerful concept, and also how new technologies like AI are fundamentally reshaping it, sometimes in ways we don't even expect. Our mission here is to give you a comprehensive understanding of what freedom truly means across different contexts, hopefully giving you the insights to navigate its complexities in your own life and, the broader world.
Indeed. And we'll unpack how different societies have interpreted freedom through the ages, really digging into the philosophical underpinnings that have shaped our understanding over time. Then we'll move into how our modern digital landscape introduces completely fresh tensions, everything from what we say online to how we connect or maybe don't connect with each other anymore. It's really about understanding the subtle forces, the ones often unseen, that influence our sense of liberty, both individually and collectively.
Okay, so to kick us off, let's maybe consider a story that really highlights how different our understanding of freedom can be. This narrative, it sort of sets the stage for our first deep dive today, and it perfectly illustrates this clash of worlds. Imagine a woman, let's call her Elżbieta, who grew up in 1980s Poland. For her and her family, living in Gdańsk back then, wolność, the Polish word for freedom, was, it was almost a whispered word, right? It was a concept that always felt just out of reach. It meant freedom from something specific, from the watchful eyes of the state, from the single state-controlled narrative you got in the newspapers, from the constant underlying fear of speaking your mind or even just expressing an independent thought. It wasn't really an individual pursuit, not like we might think of it. It was more of a collective dream, something you fought for in solidarity with your neighbors, often risking everything for a shared future. Freedom was a shared risk, a shared hope, a unity born from that collective struggle. Then, history happens. The Berlin Wall falls, massive changes sweep across Eastern Europe, and eventually Elżbieta moves to America. And their freedom is presented to her completely differently. Not as this release from oppression, but an endless aisle of choices. Freedom was choosing between 50 brands of cereal or 30 different car insurance plans, or a dozen cable packages. People would say, hey, it's a free country. You be whoever you want to be. But for Elżbieta, this felt less like liberation and more like this immense pressure to constantly perform her individuality, mainly through consumption, through buying things. The solidarity she knew back home, those deep communal bonds forged in shared adversity, it felt like it was replaced by this fierce, almost aggressive individualism. She described feeling this profound loneliness in this vast ocean of choice and a strange nostalgia for a time when freedom felt, simpler, more urgent, and definitely more communal. It wasn't about what you could buy, but what you could say and believe together, as a community. As someone who spends, frankly, way too much time online, grappling with overwhelming options and personalized feeds, Elżbieta's story is incredibly powerful. It really forces us to confront the fact that a word like freedom isn't some universal product off a shelf. It's a deeply cultural artifact, shaped by history, by struggle, and often by profound personal sacrifice. For many in the West, it seems to be about individual liberty, consumer choice. But for those who lived under authoritarianism, it was about collective liberation. Her experience just vividly shows how the political and philosophical meaning of freedom can be profoundly lost in translation, and how one person's paradise of limitless choice can feel like another's isolating marketplace.
That story, yet, it resonates very deeply with the cross-cultural insights we've been looking at. It highlights perfectly that freedom is far from a universal constant. It's really context-dependent. Historically, if you look at Western thought going way back to Greek antiquity, freedom was often framed quite differently than today. It wasn't so much about external liberty, like freedom from rules, but more about freedom from want and, crucially, the ability to master oneself. The Greeks had a term for this, autarky. You see this profoundly in the philosophy of Socrates, for instance. The core idea was this inner dynamic, a kind of battle within the individual, a struggle between, let's say, base bodily desires and the mind's capacity for logic and reason. It was about achieving genuine autonomy through your own thinking capacity, a kind of self-mastery that distinguished humans from, well, mere animals.
So if I'm getting this right, it was less about external constraints, like, a tyrannical ruler or restrictive laws, and much more about internal self-control. Is that the idea? That true liberty came from within, from conquering your own base impulses and irrational thoughts, rather than just from a lack of external rules or having loads of choices. It suggests a very different path to liberation than maybe what many of us think of today.
Precisely. Exactly. And this internal self-mastery perspective, it largely continued into medieval times, actually, both in the East and the West, though it got reframed through a theological lens. Free will became a central debate then. Early Christian thinkers, for instance, they saw freedom primarily as a spiritual question. It was related to the soul's ability to choose between good and evil. It was heavily influenced by concepts like the fall and original sin. Their discussions really revolved around the extent of human freedom in thought and action, but within a metaphysical framework, not really as a socio-political theme of individual rights, like we discussed today. Thomas Aquinas, a major figure in scholasticism, he believed the ultimate mission of humanity was to achieve happiness through knowing and, importantly, obeying God. This responsibility for him was a noble justification for believers to willingly sacrifice personal freedoms, to satisfy base needs, and instead choose to abide by divine commandments. These commandments, by their very nature, limited what one might otherwise consider freedoms. It was a kind of piety-induced restraint, you could say, a chosen submission to a higher divine order rather than free action in the modern, unrestrained sense. So liberation was found through devout adherence, not from it.
Right, that's fascinating. And how did that compare with the Islamic perspective on freedom during that same period? Did they share a similar internal spiritual focus, or were there significant differences in how they thought about human agency and divine will?
Well, interestingly, there's a powerful parallel in the Islamic depiction, but with some distinct nuances, for sure. Freedom in Islam is fundamentally seen as the rejection of false deities, of anything worshipped besides God, and an exclusive, wholehearted worship of Allah alone. It's viewed not so much as a privilege for individual will or personal desires, but as a profound God-given responsibility, a trust, almost. The Quran, in Surah Al-Ahzab, verse 72, actually describes freedom as a burden, a trust amana offered to humans to be rulers and stewards on earth, a task that apparently no other creation dared to undertake. So for Muslims, freedom is a conscious choice, yes, but one made with predetermined outcomes, meaning divine consequences, good or bad, are attached to those choices. It's definitely not an existentialist license for just self-invention. In fact, it's seen as ultimately attainable through what might seem like its opposite, servitude, ubudiyya, to the Almighty. A Muslim is expected to fully embrace being a devout servant, with their entire lives revolving solely around Allah's orders and prohibitions. So both medieval Christian and Islamic worldviews, they shared common ground in their theological, moralistic, and existential values around freedom. They viewed it through a lens of divine purpose and human responsibility, where true liberation often meant submission to a higher spiritual authority.
That's a really interesting convergence on the spiritual dimension of freedom. But I understand there were also some pretty significant divergences, right? Especially when it came to separating different aspects of life, like the religious from the political or the private from the public. How did that crucial distinction, which feels so fundamental to modern Western society, actually start to emerge?
Absolutely. A crucial distinction did begin to emerge, particularly in the Christian tradition, and it laid the conceptual groundwork for much of what we understand about freedom today. That's the division between the private and public spheres. This idea is perhaps most famously articulated in the Bible in Mark 12:17, when Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God's the things that are God's." This suggested that public life, the realm of governance, law, social order, should be regulated by human political figures. The source material describes it as a humanly manifest, although godlike, political figure, rather than solely a metaphysical God. Now, that was a profound shift. It created a distinct space for human governance separate from direct divine rule. And this laid what we call the epistemological groundwork, basically setting the stage for how we know what's true and how we govern ourselves. For all those modern philosophical discussions about secular individualism versus religious collectivism, think of Montesquieu's theory of the social contract, for example, where individuals agree to certain rules for collective benefit. That kind of thinking stems from this separation.
Okay, so under this emerging Western model, the state, acting through this social contract idea, steps in to protect the public self. And individuals then agree to sacrifice some degree of personal freedom for collective benefits like security, maybe dignity, or shared infrastructure. And that's where we get our modern democratic ideals, right? Valuing the individual, but also acknowledging their necessary place within a structured society, one that tries to balance individual desires with collective needs.
Exactly. That social principle underpins most modern Western political theories, centering on democracy as a governance system that really values the individual self as the existential and political nucleus of being. However, Islam fundamentally rejects this division. Surah Al-An'am, verse 162 states, "Surely my prayer, all my acts of worship, and my living and my dying are for Allah alone, the Lord of the whole universe." This means, from an Islamic perspective, a Muslim needs no mediators, no separate Caesar to delineate public and private spheres. All aspects of life, public and private, are delineated solely by Allah's will. One's entire existence is meant to be for God. So their freedom isn't about, doing as they wish as long as they hurt no one, a motto often associated with modern liberals, as the source points out. Instead, it's about making divine commandments the sole criterion for their thoughts, their words, their actions, even if that means yielding their personal will and desires entirely to divine command. The entire framework of their existence is integrated, not separated into these secular and religious compartments.
It's fascinating how deeply religious thought shaped these foundational ideas about society and the individual. And then along comes the Enlightenment, which, as I understand it, really pushed back hard against this theistic, moralistic view of freedom, right? Ushering in new ways of thinking that would profoundly redefine what it means to be free.
Yes, the Enlightenment marked a truly radical departure. Modernist philosophers, they adopted what's often called a negative conception of freedom. The emphasis shifted to emancipation from all external constraints, political, social, cultural constructs. This was a direct rebellion against those earlier frameworks that saw freedom as either internal mastery or spiritual submission. The new idea was to liberate the individual from all external constraints. Following this, you get post-structuralist theorists who even started using the term essentialist as, well, basically an insult. They questioned the whole search for an ideal truth as some universal, immutable source of meaning. They suggested that such truths were often just social constructs, tools used to exert power. In this constructivist, postmodern framework, the individual self became the sole source of truth. It fundamentally replaced earlier sources of meaning like religion or traditional ethics, which were often dismissed as, metaphysical superstitions or outdated dogma. This really became, as the source calls it, an existential Copernicanism of the I. The individual self, its desires, its interpretations, conceptually replaced God as the ontological basis of both material and abstract worlds. Individual subjectivity became the ultimate arbiter of reality.
Wow. So with the individual placed right at the very center, conceptually replacing traditional sources of meaning, even God. I'm really curious, how did these philosophical ideas, this Copernicanism of the I, actually translate into the practical realities? The dominant ideas about freedom that shape Western societies today. What are the foundational concepts we live by now because of this massive shift?
Well, the analysis suggests that modern freedom, particularly in the West, is rooted in something it terms freedomism. Now, this isn't just a concept. It's described as an ideology where freedom itself, often carrying a kind of Christian Eurocentric subtext, becomes the sole source of meaning, value, and importance across all levels of existence, ideologically, economically, and socially. This freedomism, it subtly but powerfully regulates our contemporary realities through three main interconnected forces. These are often considered universally agreed upon and absolute, almost beyond questioning in many contexts. First, there's secularism. This isn't just the separation of church and state. It's viewed here as a modern reconfiguration of religion itself. It establishes a relationship between the I, the individual self, and the beyond, the transcendent or spiritual realm, but without direct institutional religious governance. Spirituality becomes more like a personal lifestyle choice, totally separate from state control or collective religious practice. Second, capitalism. Considered pretty much the de facto perfect economic model in this view. It regulates relationships between the I and the other. It prioritizes efficient economic interactions, competition, wealth production, often linking individual success and even moral worth directly to market participation and consumption. And third, individualism. This is deemed the ideologically flawless psychological and social order. It establishes the most efficient relationship between the I and itself. It emphasizes self-reliance, personal achievement, and the pursuit of individual desires as the primary drivers of societal well-being and personal fulfillment.
It's fascinating how these powerful, seemingly abstract ideas, secularism, capitalism, individualism, kind of merge together to define freedom for us today. Makes me think back to Elubita's story again. She came from a world where freedom was a collective fight from oppression, and found herself in a society where freedom felt like this mandate for individual consumption. Was this shift, this Copernicanism of the I, as you called it, was it the very mechanism that created the loneliness she felt in that huge ocean of choice?
Absolutely. I think that's a key insight. What's crucial to understand is that these aren't just academic concepts floating around. They've effectively become the unquestioned operating system of many modern Western societies. They subtly dictate our aspirations, our ethical frameworks, even our definitions of success. For instance, individualism, while celebrating self-reliance and personal choice, can inadvertently foster exactly the kind of loneliness Elubita felt. It can replace deep communal bonds with the sort of pressure to constantly perform a unique identity through what we buy or consume. This often overlooks the deep human need for belonging and collective purpose that defines freedom in other cultural contexts. This whole cocktail of ideas really took root profoundly with a major historical turning point, the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther and others, they challenged Catholic principles by asserting the individual's ability to interpret the Bible and achieve salvation through faith alone, sola fide, rather than through good deeds or the mediation of a hierarchical church. Now, this was a profound liberation of the self from those metaphysical burdens. You no longer needed a priest to intercede for your soul, right? It provided a direct access to God, completely bypassing traditional church structures. Every believer was considered a kind of priest capable of their own scriptural interpretation under the sola scriptura doctrine. This emphasis on individual interpretation, personal responsibility, and a direct relationship with the divine directly contributed to the modern Western focus on individual freedom. And then you have sociologists like Max Weber, who even connected this Protestant ethic directly to the rise of capitalism. He viewed work not just as a means of production, but as an individual burden praised in the Bible, where material success could even be seen as a sign of divine favor, further reinforcing the idea of personal accountability and the pursuit of material wealth as almost a moral virtue.
That makes perfect sense. You can really see how this historical context shapes our modern debates about what freedom is and where its boundaries should lie. And the discussion about freedom often gets pretty heated when different cultural norms clash, doesn't it? The clash isn't just theoretical, it plays out in very real, often emotional ways in our daily lives, like in public spaces.
Indeed. A very vivid and highly publicized example, one that sort of succinctly illustrates the Eurocentric contradictions that can underlie modern freedom, is the burkini ban controversy, particularly in France. The term burkini itself, as the source material points out, is potentially problematic. It describes it as an apparently well-meaning, but in its analysis, dangerously Orientalist coinage. It's a blend of bikini and burqa, attempting to reconcile two culturally opposite forms of dress, right? The bikini is widely seen in the West as a symbol of women's emancipation, sexual liberation, linked to the post-1968 sexual revolution and breaking free from traditional constraints. Meanwhile, the burqa, an Arabic term for a face cover, is often viewed in Western discourse as this exotic relic of medieval patriarchal control, something that coercively covers female bodies and restricts their freedom.
But the analysis you mentioned points out issues with the concept of the burkini itself, suggesting it's more than just a simple blend. It implies a deeper, almost colonial, problematic framework.
Yes, it highlights what it sees as a profound conceptual confusion. It argues that the term conflates a pre-Islamic tribal adaptation to harsh weather conditions, the practical garment, with a religious expression of piety, the devotional act of veiling. This de-essentialist paradigm, as the source calls it, essentially strips away the deeper inherent meaning of something. It reduces a holistic religious ritual like the veil to a mere cultural emblem, almost like a fashion choice, by rejecting or materializing its metaphysical essence. This Eurocentric phrasing, where the veil is seen as morphologically derived from and symbolically inferior to the burqa, centralizes one cultural ideal of freedom bodily exposure. perhaps while marginalizing another modesty as piety. It's presented as an example of what the paper terms compulsory liberation, a kind of linguistic and symbolically tacit modernization of supposedly unmodernizable conservative traditions. It directly echoes, the source argues, the colonial white man's burden, the idea of forcibly civilizing or liberating other nations, even if it means imposing a foreign definition of liberation upon them.
Wow, so the idea is you're being liberated by being forced to conform to someone else's idea of freedom, even if that means denying your own choices or cultural or religious practices. And this is where that whole public versus private sphere debate comes roaring back, doesn't it? Especially in places like France, with its strong secular traditions, laïcité, it seems like a direct conflict over how freedom should be expressed in public versus private life.
Precisely. French secularism, or laïcité, as it's understood in this context, calls for a legal obliteration, a removal of religious self-expression from the public sphere. That includes language, attire, daily customs. Proponents believe public expression of religious beliefs should be entirely absent, even for beliefs that followers consider inherently public in nature. To them, a Muslim woman's adherence to dress codes, for example, is often interpreted as a result of a misogynistic religious discourse aiming to subjugate women and limit their autonomy. However, the Islamic existentialist paradigm, as we discussed earlier, sees it completely differently. It's viewed as obeying Allah's orders regardless of personal desires, a profound act of devotion, not a lack of individual license. This clashes directly with the Islamic perspective, where collective regulations delineate norms for the public domain, making that clear distinction between Caesar's realm and God's realm unnecessary. For a Muslim woman adhering to specific dress codes, it's framed as an act of piety, an expression of her freedom within her faith, not necessarily a restriction upon it.
So one person's freedom of expression becomes another's imposition. It just highlights how deeply ingrained these cultural norms are in defining what free actually means in practice. It creates these seemingly insurmountable conflicts where neither side maybe fully comprehends the other's perspective. It's a powerful illustration of cultural relativism in action, really.
It truly is. And the paper also discusses another interesting trend: how some modern Muslim thinkers, perhaps influenced by late capitalism and postmodern ideas, have adopted what it calls theological liberation. This apparently creates a kind of I-theism, where the individual self feels empowered to freely interpret religious texts, placing their own subjective experience of truth right at the center. This approach sometimes leads to labeling traditional views as backwardist, an accusation that, the source notes somewhat critically, hardly needs substantial evidence, implying perhaps a certain intellectual arrogance or dismissal of tradition. This can lead to a selective, linear view with history, where one feels free to label items and phenomena at will, prioritizing one's own perceived progressivism and dismissing traditional forms of knowledge or belief that don't align with that modern framework.
And this emphasis on the individual's free interpretation, often dismissing traditional views as backwardist, leads directly to a kind of free world versus not so free world dichotomy, doesn't it? A geopolitical division based on who aligns with this modernist, individualistic conception of freedom and who doesn't.
Precisely. And this geopolitical split, where freedom becomes a yardstick for international relations and even a justification for intervention, can unfortunately serve as a convenient channel for various forms of racism, discrimination, and xenophobia. It showcases how the ability to unilaterally assign meanings and categories through linguistic tools based on what the source calls linguistic arbitrariness profoundly shapes global narratives and power dynamics. This extends beyond just international relations into identity politics and the ongoing redefining of fundamental concepts like sex and gender. It's seen as driven by the individual's existential revolutionary license to free themselves from the perceived symbolic oppression of social constructs. This interventionist stance allows the self to reach this existentialist freedom, effectively politicizing the freedom paradigm in all social relations, impacting how human gatherings, societies, and even nations are structured and judged on the global stage.
That actually segues perfectly into our next deep dive. How artificial intelligence and this pervasive digitalization are fundamentally reshaping our interactions, and by extension, our very notion of freedom. This second deep dive helps us analyze these profound implications. AI, digitalization, free speech integrity, misinformation, the erosion of human connection in democracies, is perfectly encapsulated by the story of Kenji. Try to imagine a young man named Kenji living in Tokyo. His world is almost entirely digital, right? A masterpiece of algorithmic curation. He wakes up, his smart speaker, having learned his sleep patterns, plays a soothing playlist precisely tailored to his preference. His newsfeed shows him only stories aligning with past clicks and interests, a comfortable, conflict-free reality, rarely showing dissenting opinions. His friends, mostly avatars in a sprawling online game. He knows their digital skills, combat strategies, preferred weapons, but not their real faces or personal struggles. He works remotely, tasks assigned and monitored by an AI project manager, maximum efficiency, minimal human friction. In this perfectly designed digital cocoon, Kenji feels efficient, connected online, and utterly in control. He believes he has the freedom to be anyone, see anything, never be bored, curate his life perfectly. Then, one evening, a massive solar flare triggers a citywide blackout. No internet. Silent smart speaker. His apartment is suddenly terrifyingly dark. Forced outside for the first time in weeks, he sees neighbors' faces lit by flickering candles, emergency lights. No screens to hide behind, no avatars. The silence is awkward, punctuated by nervous coughs, distant city sounds unaccustomed to quiet. He doesn't know what to say, how to start a conversation, how to navigate this raw, unfiltered moment without a digital prompt. In that deeply human yet frighteningly empty moment of shared vulnerability and profound disconnection, Kenji feels this terrifying emptiness inside. He realizes his digital freedom was the freedom of a perfectly designed cage, one that protected him from the messy, unpredictable, and frighteningly real work of authentic human connection. Kenji's imagined story honestly sends a chill down my spine because it doesn't feel that much like science fiction. It's more like an exaggeration of a path we're already on. We're promised freedom by technology, freedom from inconvenience, from disagreement, from boredom. But this story highlights the profound potential cost. The proliferation of AI and digitalization isn't just creating misinformation. It might be systematically eroding the very foundation of human interaction, replacing genuine, difficult community building with smooth, frictionless, and maybe ultimately hollow connections. It makes me question how much of our authentic human experience we're willing to trade for the comfort of a personalized digital reality.
Kenji's story is indeed a powerful allegory for the challenges we face. And your opening anecdote, the one about the automated customer service labyrinth, it highlights the exact same theme, doesn't it? We're subtly being trained to interact with systems instead of people, leading to this pervasive sense of isolation. We seem to be reaching a critical level of artificiality in our society. Our reality is increasingly resembling a virtual one, mediated by screens and algorithms rather than direct, unmediated human interaction.
Yeah, it feels like the fundamental network of interhuman relations is starting to fray, maybe even actively break down in places. We're becoming aliens in our own world, as the source material puts it, increasingly isolated in these digital cocoons. And that has some pretty worrying implications for our collective well-being and the future of society, surely.
That's really the essence of the concern, this global process of maybe dehumanization and isolation, fueled by excessive digitalization and algorithmic mediation. It can lead to a whole host of profound societal issues. We're seeing, for example, an exhaustion of political motivation. Citizens feel increasingly disempowered, detached from governance, leading to widespread apathy regarding social problems. There's a growing incidence of depression and anxiety disorders, particularly among younger generations. Alongside that, increasing addiction to mood-altering substances, painkillers, tranquilizers. The level of future expectations among youth globally seems lower than ever, while the fear of global conflict and climate disequilibrium is higher than ever. All these symptoms point towards a deconstruction of the normal security and support mechanisms you'd find in a healthy, cohesive society. Meanwhile, governments often seem more focused on, preparing for war or geopolitical maneuvering than on essential social welfare programs, education, or healthcare. And at the same time, the super rich gain unprecedented fortunes. This confluence of factors really points towards failing societies on a global scale where the basic social contract seems to be eroding.
So in this increasingly artificial reality, mediated by algorithms, often driven by economic gain, what does this actually mean for something as fundamental as freedom of speech? If our interactions are mediated by algorithms and our information streams are curated, how free is our expression, really? And what are the dangers of allowing this unchecked, often manipulated flow of information?
That's a crucial question. While thinking itself should certainly be free, you can't directly control a thought. The ability to communicate personal opinions freely is becoming increasingly complex and, frankly, fraught with new challenges. The digital age has amplified the reach and sophistication of propaganda exponentially. It leverages cutting-edge insights from psychology, behavioral sciences, about human manipulability. It's no longer just top-down state messaging either. We now have influencers, bloggers, vloggers, social media figures who, maybe sometimes unknowingly, become conduits for spreading information. Some commercial, some political, some cultural, reaching vast loyal followings. And this brings us right to the thorny issue of laws against things like hate-mongering, inciting violence, racism, radicalization. If you adhere to an absolute, purely individualistic definition of free speech, meaning I can say absolutely anything I want, then these laws represent a direct contradiction, don't they?
Right, because that's a definition of freedom focused entirely on the individual, emphasizing almost boundless personal liberty. But as you highlighted, freedom isn't always purely individual, is it? It's often understood within a social context, deeply intertwined with collective well-being and a society's shared moral fabric.
Precisely. That popular saying, "My freedom ends where yours begins," is actually a bit of an oversimplification. Because freedom is fundamentally a social construct. It's deeply intertwined with society's moral fabric, its historical experiences, its shared values. Different societies have vastly different meanings of freedom and consequently implement very different restrictions. For instance, in an Islamic state, as mentioned, insulting the Prophet can carry severe penalties, reflecting deeply held religious and social norms. In contrast, many Western countries have laws against, say, Holocaust denial or racist hate-mongering, reflecting their own historical traumas and commitment to certain human rights principles, but often with different levels or types of punishment. The moral compass of the time and the prevailing culture explicitly define these boundaries. Consider, for example, how swearing on the Bible in civil trials was once a legally enforced requirement in some places, rooted in specific religious beliefs. That practice is now largely reduced to just a formal tradition in many secular societies. It shows how societal norms evolve and redefine what's considered acceptable speech or action over time.
And what about self-censorship in all this? Is that part of this complex equation of free speech, especially as societal pressures, both religious and political, shift and change? Is it ever a legitimate expression of freedom, maybe choosing politeness, or is it always a sign of its suppression?
That's a great distinction. Self-censorship, when it arises organically out of politeness, may be empathy or respect for others, like choosing not to use offensive language in certain company. That's arguably an acceptable, even positive restriction of free speech. It's a sign of social maturity, perhaps. But if it's forced by fear of punishment, fear of losing your livelihood, or worse, fear for your life, then it's clearly unacceptable. That's a sign of oppression, not freedom. In secular societies, political pressure through social shaming or economic boycotts can exert a force equivalent to religious pressure in restricting speech. And in dictatorships or one-party systems, public opposition carries very real, often brutal penalties, effectively eliminating genuine free speech altogether. Even within democracies, restrictions on what are deemed extreme political views exist, and they vary widely based on the specific type of government and its legal framework. While an ideal perspective might be rooted in universal human rights and humanistic philosophy, that ideal is often quite far from the reality in the world as it is today, even if it remains a noble goal worth striving for.
This leads us directly to the core problem of information itself in this digital world: fake news, disinformation. If speech can be so easily manipulated, if reality itself can be manufactured and spread instantly, how can we truly be free to make informed choices? How can we even define freedom if the information we base it on is potentially corrupted?
Indeed. Lies, especially in this context, are always strategic. They're never accidental. They are aimed precisely at confusing the public, manipulating public opinion, or covering up various manipulations. Even passive lies, those instances where facts are hidden or selectively omitted without actually inventing new ones, they create smokescreens that effectively keep the truth from the public, leading to distorted perceptions and misinformed decisions. In democracies, transparency is often heralded as key, right? Yet we frequently see hybrid systems where hidden components, unaccountable power structures, clandestine information operations thrive, and they're fueled by the deliberate manipulation of information across all media platforms. This isn't just old school propaganda anymore. It's a refined, scientifically informed version. It now integrates insights from psychology, neuroscience, behavioral economics. This makes it incredibly effective, almost addiction creating, because it taps directly into our cognitive biases and emotional vulnerabilities.
So the very concepts we cherish, like a free press and free speech, they become inherently dangerous if fake news and, say, fake science are presented without critical scrutiny right alongside real facts. It just blurs the lines of truth and undermines the very foundation of public trust. In such a context, how do we even begin to define freedom? Does it just mean anything goes, or must there be some kind of collective framework?
The idea of absolute, unbounded freedom becomes really problematic, even self-defeating in that kind of environment. The source material suggests a more robust and socially integrated definition. It proposes, freedom is a process you construct together with others without creating conflicts, like truth has to avoid contradictions. This means freedom is not just an isolated individual right, but a dynamic social construction. The source calls it a social pseudo-organism, a collection of individuals living and interacting harmoniously. This implies that the freedom of the group and its collective well-being naturally controls, in a sense, the freedom of individuals. A form of group self-control where collective interests ensure individual liberties are exercised responsibly. Now, this is presented as a profoundly positive aspect, where a truly free society actively supports individuals whose freedom is attacked or threatened because their freedom is seen as integral to the health of the whole. However, our current society, often driven primarily by economic gain and individualistic competition, isn't necessarily this free society in that sense. Control is often guided by punitive measures rather than shared values. Achieving this kind of free society would require a fundamental shift in values, emphasizing honest human values over perhaps superficial financial ones. This is likely a long-term goal, a generational project, ideally achieved through what the source calls a peaceful philosophical revolution, a reimagining of our collective priorities.
This brings us directly to one of the biggest, most tangible threats to information integrity and, thus, to an informed and free society in our digital age.
Deepfakes. What exactly are we talking about here? And how do they differ from just any AI-generated image or, a photoshopped picture?
Right. Deepfakes, it's a portmanteau, a blend of deep learning and fake, are hyper-realistic multimedia content. That could be images, audio, or video generated by advanced artificial intelligence algorithms. The key distinction from just any AI-generated image is usually their malicious intent. Deepfakes specifically aim to deceive viewers into believing they're seeing authentic content, often portraying individuals saying or doing things they never actually did. For instance, the source mentions fake images appearing in scientific publications, deliberately misleading researchers. They are designed primarily to sow confusion and erode trust in visual and auditory evidence.
Okay, and how are these generated? What are the underlying technologies that make them so incredibly convincing, almost indistinguishable from reality sometimes? Primarily, they're generated through advanced generative models. These are a class of AI algorithms specifically designed to create new, realistic data that mimics data it was trained on. State-of-the-art approaches include diffusion-based models, things like DALL-E 2 and Midjourney that many people are familiar with now. These are neural networks trained on massive data sets of images and corresponding text descriptions. This training enables them to generate incredibly convincing images from simple text prompts or even to manipulate existing images in realistic ways. The process is sometimes likened to denoising an image, starting from pure static and refining it into a coherent, realistic picture. Then there are generative adversarial networks, or GANs. These are deep learning systems like CycleGAN, DCGAN, WGAN, very commonly used for image generation and deepfake creation. A GAN architecture basically consists of two neural networks pitted against each other, a generator that creates the fake content and a discriminator that tries to tell if the content is real or fake. They're trained in this continuous adversarial game where the generator constantly gets better at fooling the discriminator, and the discriminator gets better at detecting the fakes. The quality of deepfakes from GANs depends heavily on the quantity and variety of the training data available, and research is ongoing to try and synthesize minimum training data needed for deepfake generation, which could make them even easier and cheaper to create.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, particularly for democratic elections, where public perception and trust in information sources are just so crucial. How exactly do deepfakes pose a direct threat to the electoral process and the very foundations of democracy?
It is indeed considered one of the most significant threats to civic discourse and democratic integrity today. The danger is really multifaceted. First, altering voter preferences. Deepfakes can directly influence voter choices by fabricating scenarios. Imagine a candidate appearing to take policy positions they don't actually hold, or worse, engaging in illegal or immoral behavior. This undermines public trust not just in that candidate, but potentially in the entire electoral process. Think of a deepfake video showing a candidate making a racist remark or taking a bribe. Even if it's quickly debunked, the initial damage can be significant. Second, voter suppression. Coordinated disinformation campaigns using deepfake videos could try to prevent citizens from voting, spreading false information about election procedures, like wrong polling dates or locations. Or they could even intimidate voters through blackmail, threatening to release fabricated, compromising content if they don't comply with certain demands. This actively damages democratic participation. Third, rapid amplification. And this is perhaps the most concerning aspect: the speed and scale. Amplified through social media and messaging platforms, deepfakes can rapidly reach millions of users before fact-checkers or platforms can even react. This widespread false or misleading information confuses citizens about candidates and issues, making it incredibly difficult for individuals to engage in informed civic discourse. And fourth, real-world instances. This isn't just theoretical anymore. We've already seen manipulated videos of public figures like Nancy Pelosi or Volodymyr Zelensky circulating, designed specifically to sow distrust. More disturbingly, in the 2023 Argentina elections, both leading candidates, Javier Milei and Sergio Massa, explicitly created and spread deepfake images and videos of each other to portray their opponent negatively. This demonstrated the very real and immediate vulnerability of democratic elections to this technology.
So how has this technology evolved to become so sophisticated? And maybe more importantly, can we even detect them effectively once they're out there in the wild? What are the current capabilities of deepfake detection? Are they keeping pace with the generation methods?
Well, the technology has advanced remarkably quickly. Before around 2014, digital manipulation relied mostly on traditional methods like splicing, editing things often detectable to a trained eye. But with the emergence of GANs in 2014, we saw a huge leap forward. This led to academic projects like Face-to-Face, which could superimpose one person's expressions onto another's face in video, and Synthesizing Obama, which realistically animated a still image of the former president based on audio. By September 2017, the term deepfake gained public notoriety. Initially, unfortunately, through non-consensual explicit content, highlighting the immense potential for misuse right away. Since 2018, open-source tools like Deepface Lab have made creation much more accessible to a wider audience. And ongoing integration with even more powerful AI architectures like transformers and diffusion models aims for even higher quality, more seamless fakes. Detection techniques broadly fall into two categories. Spatial, which looks for inconsistencies or artifacts within the image's space, things like pixel-level anomalies, strange shadows, unnatural textures, and spatiotemporal, which considers changes in both space and time. Analyzing movement patterns, blinking rates, microexpressions over a sequence of video frames. The latter, the spatiotemporal methods, have generally proven more accurate because they can capture dynamic inconsistencies that might be missed in a single frame.
But are these detection tools effective enough to keep pace? Especially considering the challenges of real-world application, like low-quality videos we see all over social media.
They show promise, definitely, but significant challenges persist. Tools based on architectures like FaceSwap GAN, SimSwap, and FaceShifter do exhibit high accuracy in controlled lab-like environments. They're particularly good at rendering realistic facial features and improving perceptual consistency, making their fakes harder to spot manually. CycleGAN, notably, is mentioned for its exceptional user-friendliness and versatility. It doesn't require paired data, meaning you don't need a perfectly matched real and fake image to train it, which simplifies the process and makes it more cost-effective for malicious actors. However, there are big hurdles for detection in the real world. Detection algorithms often struggle with low-quality videos, which are incredibly common online. Compression artifacts, noise, blurriness, these can obscure the subtle, telltale signs that reveal a deepfake. Time consumption is also a major concern for real-world applications. Analyzing vast amounts of video data in real time is computationally very intensive, hindering widespread adoption for platforms. There's also the challenge of insufficient training data for specific characters. If a deepfake is made of someone new, detection systems might need time-consuming retraining to recognize the specific manipulation techniques used for that person. Dataset quality is another issue. Training data is often created under ideal laboratory conditions, which differs significantly from the messy, varied scenarios of real-world deepfakes encountered online. Moreover, general-purpose deepfake tools still have limitations and require more research for enhanced efficiency and truly undetectable output. It's really a constant arms race between the creators and the detectors.
Given all these immense challenges, what are platforms and governments actually doing about it? How are they trying to regulate or at least mitigate the spread of deepfakes and the damage they can cause to public discourse and democratic processes?
Well, social media platforms, facing immense pressure and public scrutiny, are implementing various policies, though their effectiveness is still a subject of ongoing debate and research. Meta, which includes Facebook, Instagram, Threads, they state they remove manipulated media that violates their community standards, things like graphic violence, content aimed at voter suppression, or hate speech. They've also initiated challenges like the Deepfake Detection Challenge to incentivize researchers to improve detection tools. X, formerly Twitter. Their policy prohibits misleading synthetic or manipulated media that is likely to cause harm, especially concerning public safety or election integrity. However, they generally allow things like memes, satire, and parody, which creates a potentially tricky line to draw. They may label posts identified as manipulated and reduce their visibility. YouTube. They now require creators to disclose altered or synthetic content that is realistic. They label it clearly for viewers in the description and the video player itself. They also reserve the right to remove content that realistically simulates identifiable individuals in a misleading way, and say they work with creators to ensure compliance. Reddit. Their policy broadly bans content that impersonates individuals or entities in a misleading or deceptive manner, which explicitly includes deepfakes presented with the intent to mislead. TikTok. They actually have some of the stricter policies noted. They ban deepfakes of private figures and young people entirely. For all realistic AI deepfakes of public figures, they require clear disclosure to prevent viewer confusion. Beyond these platform policies, monitoring these regulations effectively is a huge challenge. It involves ensuring compliance from platforms and content creators, regularly assessing the effectiveness of detection tools against new generation methods, and promoting widespread public education initiatives to increase media literacy, teaching people how to spot potential fakes. There's also a critical need for international collaboration, given the global and borderless nature of disinformation. Something created in one country can instantly spread worldwide. Key areas for further intervention, as outlined in the sources, include things like implementing authentication protocols, perhaps digital watermarks or certification systems for legitimate media. Mandating transparency through clear labeling of all AI-manipulated content, not just harmful deepfakes. Expanding media literacy programs in schools and public campaigns to teach critical assessment skills. And establishing clear legal consequences, not just for spreading, but for the malicious creation and distribution of deepfakes. This requires a continuous, proactive, and coordinated effort from policymakers, technologists, educators, and the public to try and stay ahead of the curve.
That brings us to our final deep dive today, exploring that inherent tension between individual moral autonomy and prevailing societal norms, especially within Western democracies. This third dive looks at that evolving dynamic, individual freedom versus societal expectations, and how it shapes the practical application and perceived limits of personal freedom. I saw a story online a while back that really stuck with me, about a high school art teacher in a small conservative town in Texas. Let's call her Mrs. Albright. She believed deeply in her students' freedom of expression, saw it as essential for creativity, critical thinking. For the annual town art fair, she encouraged them to create pieces about their lives, what mattered to them, to speak their truth through art. One student, whose family was struggling with the devastating health and environmental impacts of a local factory's pollution, painted this stark, powerful landscape. He showed a vibrant, once pristine river, now discolored, choked, flowing ominously from the factory, which happened to be the town's largest employer. The painting was technically brilliant, emotionally resonant, and deeply critical. Mrs. Albright, seeing its artistic merit and profound message, displayed it proudly at the fair. Now, she wasn't censored by the government. Her freedom of speech and the students' freedom of expression were legally protected under the First Amendment. But the societal backlash, that invisible yet powerful force, was immense. Parents called for her dismissal, labeling her a radical pushing an agenda undermining community values. The local newspaper, conveniently owned by an executive from the very factory depicted, ran a scathing editorial questioning her judgment, her loyalty to the town. Old friends started avoiding her in the grocery store. Parents pulled their kids from her classes. The freedom she championed for her student resulted in her own profound social and professional isolation. She was free to act on her principles, yes, but the community's unwritten norms, protecting the local economy, avoiding public conflict, maintaining a facade of unity, made exercising that freedom almost unbearable. She faced this brutal choice: uphold her moral autonomy and artistic principles, or maintain her place and relationships within the community. This story about Mrs. Albright is just a perfect example of that tension between individual liberty and societal pressure that exists even in the most robust democracies. Legally, she was fine, but in practice, her freedom to express a difficult truth was severely limited by the prevailing norms of her society. Her experience forces us to ask a critical question. What is the real value of freedom if the social cost of using it is complete ostracism? It suggests that a truly free society requires more than just laws. It requires a deep cultural tolerance for difficult truths, uncomfortable conversations, and dissenting viewpoints.
Mrs. Albright's story, yeah, it beautifully illustrates that complex push and pull between individual liberties and community expectations. It's a vivid, real-world manifestation of a debate that has spanned centuries, really. That fundamental balance between an individual's freedom and their obligations to the society they live in. It highlights that freedom isn't just an isolated abstract concept. It's deeply embedded within social interactions, community values, and often, as in her case, economic realities.
So it's not just freedom versus responsibility in a simplistic sense. It's a much more intricate web of distinctions, isn't it? Things like individual rights versus collective duties, or personal autonomy versus the need for social order. These nuances seem crucial to understanding the full picture of how freedom operates in our world.
Exactly. The sources we looked at lay out these distinctions very clearly, and each one represents a different facet of this fundamental tension that Miss Albright faced. First, you have freedom versus responsibility. This is the core tension between an individual's choices and their obligations to the community. While some argue for complete individual freedom, others emphasize the duties that come with being part of a larger group. It's the ongoing challenge in modern societies, balancing personal desires with the well-being of the whole. Think about driving. Your freedom to drive comes with the responsibility to follow traffic laws for public safety. Then there's individual rights versus collective duties. This is a philosophical debate centering on the right to pursue happiness without interference, like freedom of religion or expression balanced against duties like paying taxes, serving on a jury, or following public health laws during a pandemic. These duties, while potentially limiting personal freedoms, are often seen as necessary for maintaining social order, funding public services, and meeting basic needs. Also, personal autonomy versus social order. Personal autonomy is that fundamental right to make your own decisions about your life, health, beliefs, crucial for self-determination. Social order, conversely, is about maintaining stability, harmony, predictability within a society, often through traditional values, customs, or laws. Utilitarianism, as a philosophical framework, tries to maximize overall happiness by finding a balance here. Personal autonomy contributes to individual happiness, while social order prevents chaos and ensures collective flourishing. We also see liberty versus authority. This concept explores the inherent tension between personal freedom, the ability to act, think, speak without external constraint, and the need for social order and control, typically exercised by a governing authority. Individualism emphasizes personal freedom as paramount, while authoritarianism prioritizes submission to societal rules dictated by the state. It's complex, as societies need both freedom for innovation and progress, and some degree of authority for stability. Then self-determination versus public welfare. This involves weighing an individual's right to determine their own destiny, life choices, bodily autonomy against the well-being of society as a whole. Mandatory vaccinations during a public health crisis are a classic example. An individual's choice versus protecting public health. Zoning laws are another restricting individual property rights for the perceived collective good of community development. Private interests versus common good. This conflict arises when individuals or groups prioritize their own self-interest, maximizing profit, convenience over the collective well-being of the community or planet. Debates on environmental protection, like emission standards for factories, or social welfare programs like universal health care, often reflect this. Regulations are often necessary for health and safety, even if they limit individual actions or economic freedoms. Rights versus obligations distinguishes inherent civil liberties, freedom of speech, religion, assembly from societal obligations like contributing to community service, participating in civic life, or simply following laws. It recognizes that while individuals have fundamental freedoms, they also have a responsibility to contribute to the common good. And finally, autonomy versus interdependence. Autonomy is that ability to make independent decisions, vital for personal growth and individuality. Interdependence, on the other hand, emphasizes our reliance on others for survival, well-being, and the functioning of society itself. This balance is debated, acknowledging that while we strive for independence, we are inherently connected and depend on each other for social cohesion and collective progress. Miss Albright's story is a poignant illustration. Her autonomous act clashed with her interdependence on her community.
And even when we think about something as fundamental and, let's face it, cherished as freedom of speech, it's clearly not absolute. Hate speech is the key area where boundaries are drawn pretty explicitly in many places, showing that society does set limits on individual expression to protect vulnerable groups or perhaps just maintain basic civility.
That's right. Freedom of speech is a cornerstone of many democracies, allowing individuals to express opinions without fear of government repression. But it's almost universally understood to have limitations. Hate speech, for example. Speech that incites hatred, discrimination, or violence against individuals or groups based on characteristics like race, religion, gender, sexual orientation is typically regulated by laws in many countries. This is done specifically to protect vulnerable groups and to try and balance free expression with the prevention of harm and the maintenance of public order. Similarly, that ongoing privacy versus security debate highlights the tension between an individual's desire for personal information to be protected from unauthorized access, whether by government surveillance or cybercriminals, and the perceived broader societal need for such measures for national security, law enforcement, or cybersecurity. It's a constant negotiation, a trade-off.
How does all this play out in the broader context of social cohesion? The very fabric that holds a society together. Technology must have a massive impact here, acting as both a unifying and a fracturing force, right?
Absolutely. Social cohesion, the degree to which a society feels connected and united through shared values, trust, and a sense of belonging, is profoundly affected by technology, in both positive and negative ways. Positively, technology obviously increases connectivity across vast distances. It enhances instant communication, provides access to vast amounts of information, potentially strengthening bonds and enabling new communities based on shared interests. You can connect with like-minded people globally who share niche hobbies or political views. However, it also has significant negative impacts, which often seem to undermine this very cohesion. Social isolation. Ironically, excessive screen time and reliance on virtual interactions can reduce face-to-face communication, leading to feelings of loneliness, detachment, and maybe a certain superficiality in relationships. Polarization. Online echo chambers and filter bubbles reinforce existing beliefs by limiting exposure to diverse perspectives. This creates deep divisions and animosity between groups. Algorithms often prioritize engagement, meaning sensational or extreme content gets amplified, pushing people further into their own ideological corners. Misinformation. The widespread circulation of false or misleading information online erodes trust not just in institutions and media, but also trust between individuals. This undermines social cohesion and makes collective action much harder. When people can't even agree on basic facts, cooperation becomes incredibly difficult. Digital divide. The persistent gap in access to technology, high-speed internet, and necessary devices exacerbates existing inequalities. It excludes significant portions of the population from educational, economic, and social opportunities, deepening societal divides. Mental health. Numerous studies link excessive social media use to increased anxiety, depression, and a distorted sense of reality, often due to constant comparison with curated, idealized online lives. Algorithmic governance. Algorithms increasingly determine what information we see, what products are recommended, even critical decisions made by institutions. While seemingly neutral, they can amplify existing societal biases, leading to discriminatory outcomes. We've seen this, for example, with facial recognition technology being demonstrably less accurate for people of color, potentially perpetuating existing inequalities. And political discourse. While social media provides a platform for debate and activism, it's widely criticized for spreading misinformation and exacerbating political polarization through algorithmic amplification of sensational or inflammatory content, making reasoned, nuanced debate exceedingly difficult.
It's clearly a double-edged sword then, and a really challenging landscape to navigate. How do we possibly mitigate these negative impacts and promote a more cohesive society in the digital age? Especially when the very structures of the technology sometimes seem to work against it.
Well, the sources suggest a multi-pronged approach is needed. Firstly, it's crucial to promote digital literacy and critical thinking skills across all age groups, enabling individuals to evaluate information critically, identify misinformation, understand online biases, manipulation tactics. It's also vital to try and foster a culture of empathy and respect online, encouraging civil discourse and actively seeking out and listening to different perspectives, rather than just retreating into comfortable echo chambers. For policymakers and tech companies, there's a significant responsibility here. They need to address the ethical implications head-on, things like data privacy, algorithmic bias, and develop policies that actively promote social cohesion rather than undermining it, perhaps purely for profit. From an ESG, environmental, social governance perspective, the impact of technology on social cohesion is inextricably linked to broader sustainability challenges. This includes the environmental footprint of tech massive data centers' energy consumption, the e-waste crisis, its social impact on employment and inequality, especially with AI potentially leading to job displacement in some sectors. and the critical need for ethical governance and platform regulation to ensure technology is developed and used for the common good, not just for corporate gain or societal fragmentation.
And finally, if we zoom out from individual experiences and these technological shifts to the global stage, how does this tension between individual freedom and societal norms, especially in the context of technological advancements and the proliferation of information, how does that connect to the state of democracy worldwide? It sounds like there's a pretty significant struggle unfolding right now.
The global landscape, according to the analysis, reveals a rather dire threat to liberal democracy. We've seen an alarming trend, 16 consecutive years of declining global freedom recorded by some measures. Authoritarian regimes seem to be becoming more effective at co-opting or circumventing international norms meant to support basic liberties. And they're providing alternative models of governance and aid to other nations, thereby weakening traditional democratic alliances. Meanwhile, internal forces within democracies themselves are exploiting system shortcomings to promote division and undermine trust from within. As of today, some analyses suggest around 38% of the global population lives in countries designated as not free. That's the highest proportion since 1997, apparently, while only about 20% live in free countries. It indicates a significant and, frankly, concerning shift in the global order, where autocratic models seem to be gaining ground.
So what does a democracy even mean in this shifting world? Especially when some authoritarian states claim to be democratic through tightly controlled elections or promoting this idea of democracy with their own characteristics, it feels like the very definition is under attack and being reinterpreted.
You're absolutely right. The term is increasingly contested. True democracy, as the source defines it, is far more than just holding elections, however flawed. It's a governing system based fundamentally on the will and consent of the governed. It requires institutions that are genuinely accountable to all citizens, unwavering adherence to the rule of law, and profound respect for universal human rights. It features a robust network of mutually reinforcing structures with checks and balances, things like independent courts, a free press, a vibrant civil society, both within and outside the state apparatus. It requires an openness to peaceful power transitions, where rival candidates compete fairly for the public good, not merely for personal power or enrichment. Crucially, it also aims to create a level playing field so all people, regardless of their background, can enjoy universal human rights and participate meaningfully in politics. And perhaps most practically, democracy is also seen as an inherent engine of self-correction. It has mechanisms, ideally, to allow for continuous improvement and adaptation when parts of the system falter or fail. It can address its own shortcomings.
But autocrats are actively promoting an alternative model, aren't they? And it seems they've become quite adept at creating a favorable international environment for their vision of governance, one that emphasizes state control over individual liberties.
Yes, exactly. They've managed to create a more favorable international environment for themselves. One not based on some unifying ideology or even genuinely serving their population's best interests, but often on a shared, cynical interest in minimizing checks on their own power and maintaining their grip. The Chinese Communist Party, for example, is identified as playing a leading role here by promoting its interpretation of state sovereignty. This idea essentially allows governments to act within their borders without external oversight or criticism, effectively shielding human rights abuses from international scrutiny. The CCP also offers an alternative source of international support and investment, bypassing traditional democratic lenders or aid organizations that might attach conditions related to human rights or governance. This helps would-be autocrats entrench themselves and sometimes even adopt aspects of the CCP governance model, like sophisticated surveillance technologies or methods of information control. Furthermore, the CCP is seen leveraging its vast economic clout and sometimes even military threats to suppress international criticism of its own violations of human rights and democratic principles, as seen with actions regarding civil liberties in Hong Kong or the international concerns raised about Xinjiang. We've seen instances cited where companies or nations hesitate to speak out, like the Marriott Hotel declining to host a World Uyghur Congress, or New Zealand reportedly hesitating to label actions in Xinjiang as genocide, potentially due to crucial trade concerns. This shows the pervasive nature of that influence.
And the pretense of genuinely competitive elections seems to be dropping in some places, as more authoritarian regimes consolidate power not just through outright suppression, but through increasingly sophisticated yet often transparently rigged processes.
Indeed. Russia's September 2021 elections, for instance, saw the regime imprisoning opposition leader Alexei Navalny beforehand and preventing associated candidates from even running. The balloting itself was widely reported as marred by irregularities. Nicaragua's November 2021 presidential vote was similarly uncompetitive. President Daniel Ortega's government systematically arrested opposition candidates and canceled the legal status of numerous civil society organizations leading up to the vote. Hong Kong's December 2021 Legislative Council elections starkly underscored Beijing's dismantling of its promised semi-democratic institutions. An electoral reform drastically diminished direct suffrage and allowed authorities to exclude candidates deemed unpatriotic. Beyond elections, coups are also noted as being on the rise. Seen in Myanmar in February 2021, which led to the world's largest single-year contraction in freedom that year, as well as military takeovers in Sudan, Guinea, and Mali around the same period. These indicate perhaps a weakening of international deterrence against such actions. Even incumbent civilian leaders are seen undermining democratic institutions from within. Tunisia's President Kais Saied, for example, in July 2021 dismissed parliament and unilaterally altered the constitution to extend his power and eliminate checks and balances.
And it's not just external threats or overt coups. Within established democracies themselves, there's also this worrying rot, as the source calls it, where illiberal forces work to manipulate systems from the inside, chipping away at the very principles they might claim to uphold. It's internal erosion, too.
This is a critical point, and perhaps one that many established democracies are only now fully grappling with. The assault on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, fueled by unsubstantiated claims of a stolen election, is presented as a stark example of illiberal forces attempting to overturn legitimate electoral results from within a democratic system. Similar trends are noted elsewhere. In Brazil, former President Jair Bolsonaro preemptively claimed electoral fraud regarding the electronic voting system, sowing distrust in the democratic process before a vote even occurred. In El Salvador, the government of Nayib Bukele has been criticized for systematically undermining democratic institutions by replacing Supreme Court magistrates and other judges with loyalists, effectively consolidating power. Even in seemingly robust democracies like India or Poland, there are concerns cited about leaders eroding the rule of law and democratic norms. Poland's Law and Justice Party, for instance, has faced criticism for packing courts with loyalists and even challenging the supremacy of EU legislation over national law. These internal weaknesses are then cleverly exploited by external authoritarian powers. The example given is Belarus facilitating migrants to EU borders, aiming to create political division within the EU and encourage member states to act in contradiction with their stated values regarding asylum, thereby exposing vulnerabilities.
It sounds quite grim, honestly, this global picture of declining freedom and democratic backsliding, both from external pressures and this internal erosion. Is there any significant cause for hope amidst these challenging trends, or are we simply witnessing an inevitable decline?
No, there absolutely is cause for hope, and the report highlights it strongly. Despite the grim statistics, there remains a continued powerful popular demand for democracy worldwide. We see countless people risking their lives, their livelihoods in pursuit of freedom, often in the face of overwhelming odds. Millions also undertake dangerous journeys to try and live freely elsewhere, a phenomenon that in itself is seen as an emphatic endorsement of democratic ideals over autocratic ones. Examples like Ecuador's democratic reforms over the past 5 years, resulting in a peaceful transfer of power despite political tensions, Chile's ambitious and inclusive constitutional convention process, and Montenegro's complex political transition offer tangible signs of democratic resilience and progress in some areas. In Myanmar, despite the brutal military coup, widespread resistance and civil disobedience movements, including general strikes, silent protests, are actively denying the regime legitimacy and crippling its ability to function effectively, showing profound civilian courage against military rule. There's also growing pushback against the influence of certain authoritarian powers. Diplomatic boycotts of major events hosted in China by several countries over human rights concerns send a signal. Organizations like the Women's Tennis Association suspending tournaments in China, explicitly sacrificing revenue to defend human rights principles, also demonstrate that principled stands are possible. These actions, while sometimes small, send powerful signals globally.
So the path forward isn't necessarily about imposing democracy from the outside, which has a problematic history anyway, but rather a concerted global effort that empowers and supports those already fighting for it on the ground. Bolstering the internal forces for change seems key.
Exactly. Reversing this decline requires a bold, sustained response that places democracy support genuinely at the heart of foreign policy and domestic reform efforts. It involves both governments working together and active, engaged citizens. It's not about longing for some bygone era, but confronting past mistakes, adapting strategies to the current challenges. While international assistance and solidarity are crucial to counter the tactical advantages autocrats often have, it's ultimately local human rights defenders, grassroots civil society organizations, and empowered electorates who must chart their own country's future. They are the true agents of democratic change. Initiatives like the Summit for Democracy, aiming to bring together world leaders and civil society, are seen as a promising start. They emphasize coordinated international policies alongside strengthened domestic governance to create more just and prosperous nations. The prevalence of democratic ideas and the certainty of global progress perhaps can't be taken for granted anymore, as maybe they were in the past. But active proponents, through sustained effort, collaboration, and courage, can still push authoritarian practices back to the margins of human experience, where many believe they truly belong.
What an incredible deep dive today into the elusive, ever-changing nature of freedom. We've journeyed from ancient philosophical ideals of self-mastery all the way to medieval spiritual definitions, then through the Enlightenment's radical individualism, and finally landing squarely in the digital dilemmas of deepfakes, algorithmic control, and the pressures on human connection. We've seen how personal autonomy constantly battles against deeply ingrained societal norms, and how these powerful forces play out on the global stage, impacting the very state of democracy worldwide. It's abundantly clear that freedom isn't some static concept set in stone. It's a living, breathing idea, constantly being reshaped by our collective actions, our technological advancements, and our evolving understanding of ourselves and our place in the world.
And perhaps the most profound insight from our exploration today might just be this. Our genuine freedom in this increasingly interconnected, complex world isn't merely about the absence of external chains, nor is it simply about having an abundance of personal choices, like a Lubiera found. It seems it is increasingly defined by the deliberate, often difficult choices we make in cultivating authentic human connection, pursuing and protecting shared truths, and recognizing that the integrity of our collective reality is inextricably linked to the boundaries and indeed the responsibilities of our individual liberties.